Hey everyone, so here's our notes on fungi, and I guess the first thing we can fix up at the top here, that's chapter 13. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be typing these in as we go, but my computer's off to be fixed tomorrow, so hopefully it happens fast. Fun facts about fungi. Yeah, they're your magic mushrooms, all kinds of things, mystical powers to make you see pink and purple elephants, I don't know, whatever. But you might want to make sure you know what you're eating because if you get into the Amida genus, well, you've got some nasty poisonous kinds of mushrooms out there. Abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, damage to your liver, kidneys, muscles, and the symptoms can persist up to 8 days, and death occurs in about 50 to 90%. So have fun. Make sure you know what mushrooms you're eating. Um, Little matching game here. Focus on your vocab and thinking about the root words or root of words and prefixes. So have a go at this. See if you can match the biologist with their field of study. Pause the video and then fire it back up for the answers. All right. Well, having just finished our microorganisms, hopefully you got E for microbiologists. Fungi are mycologists. So we'll see that coming up here. Focus on that part of the word myco, which we'll see in their reproductive life cycles. Plants would be botanists and algae, including your multicellular algae. We talked about phycology and phycologist, and fossils, of course, paleontologists. So general characteristics and structure of these guys, they are, of course, eukaryotic. They are multicellular, with the exception of yeast, which we'll see down below, which are unicellular. Oops. They are, of course, heterotrophic. But what we'll also see is another term we talked about a little bit. That's that they are saprophytic, all right, as decomposers feeding on dead organic matter. And they have cell walls, so similar to plants, except for the cell walls are made from chitin. Remember that, right? So this is a carbohydrate that differs from cellulose, right? And for the most part, they are immobile, but what we will see is that in some cases their reproductive cells are mobile, which we'll look at. We'll see that in lots of different species. So I'm going to try and use some highlighting here and fill things in as we go. So for most of us, when we think of a fungus, we might think of this structure you see to the right, the classic mushroom, the toadstool, which in fact, most species are molds and are multicellular, like I said, except for yeasts. And although we might be familiar with this piece that's sticking up, the majority of the fungus actually lives within the soil and underground, and we don't see most of it. So for example, here the largest, and it's considered to be the largest organism in the world, Armorillia, which lives underground, occupies a space of about 8 hectares. So we'll see this with their network mesh of fibers that grow within the soil, can take up an enormous amount of space. So the piece that you see at right here, this is what we actually call the fruiting body. So I missed that spot over here, but that is the fruiting body, which is primarily its reproductive structure. All right. And then the network of mesh-like hairs and stuff that we don't typically see, those are referred to as the hyphae, or collectively. So individually they're hyphae, collectively the whole network is the mycelium. All right. So from the typical mushroom or the fruiting body, its primary, as a fruiting body, it is the reproductive structure and it's responsible for producing spores. Right, so we'll see that the primary reproductive piece of the mushroom is a spore, and they're produced from the underside of this cap well, in this particular species, but we'll look at the reproductive cycles of sort of three major phyla, and you can see how the fruiting body is a little bit different in each. And then what you see exposed underneath that fruiting body and all through the ground here, these are those filaments, which we call hyphae. And when you have a mat of them, a massive collection of them, we call them mycelium or mycelia for plural. And these hyphae can differ from species to species, so it can actually be part of how they're classified. So part of how they are classified. And there's sort of two main groups. So you call one group is the septate, which means they have walls, septate walls dividing their nuclei. And so you can see in the picture here, you sort of see walls like making individual cells, whereas the other group is coencytic, and basically they lack septate or walls between their nuclei. Okay, much like we talked about with bacteria, we talk about their nutrition, how they got modes of nutrition, very diverse with bacteria. Mushrooms, a little bit less diverse, but kind of cover all the areas. So one, they are saprophytic. So this means that they feed on dead organic matter, right? So hence their very important role as decomposers. But they're not all just saprophytic. So some are, many are parasitic. So many feed on a host, like a living host, and typically cause disease in the case of many plant-like diseases. So if you think of, if you know a little bit about trees and forestry, so foresters or even sawmills and stuff like that that are cutting wood out of various trees. You get heart rot or root rot, and all of these are related to various types of fungi that infect the plant and lead to disease. And some of them are predators. And as predators, so they literally have specialized hyphae that can trap various organisms, from insects to bacteria, etc., and engulf. So one thing to keep in mind about this parasitic aspect, right, is that I want to keep emphasizing the sort of symbiotic relationships, and even being parasitic is a form of symbiosis, but it's characterized by what we call sort of the plus minus relationship, right? Meaning that one organism, the fungi, is benefiting, and the other organism, whether it be a plant or an insect or whatever, is not benefiting, right? So check out the zombie ants that I've got in our video notes. It's an article, but talking about how they can be parasitic not just on plants, but on many different kinds of animals, insects in particular. All right. The one key thing about all methods, regardless, is that it involves what we call extracellular digestion. So let me just put that in here. So extracellular digestion. So essentially what they're doing is they're excreting enzymes. So whenever you think of a fungus, lots of people, especially out in nature in the forest floor, kind of see this slimy, sort of glossy-like texture and look to it. And that's because they're excreting this film of digestive enzymes, and those digestive enzymes break down, whether it's the tree or the plant or whatever, that sort of causes the plant to break down, and then they absorb the carbohydrate from that. So at that point, the carbohydrate is representing is glucose, right? So they've broken down the complex carbohydrates, the starches, and the cellulose that make up the plant or animal and break it down into glucose and then absorb that glucose and store that glucose as glycogen. Well, a bit like we talked about the evolution of bacteria and how the sort of the process of biogenesis, how the compounds that formed living organisms first evolved and then they came together to make the first prokaryotic cells. And then from there, we talked about how protists may evolve, the first eukaryotic cells through endosymbiosis. Well, it's thought that the fungi would have evolved in a similar process where they likely unicellular fungi evolved from prokaryotes in the same process of endosymbiosis. Right? These are eukaryotic cells, remember, and so likely prokaryotic cells being engulfed by other prokaryotic cells led to the various types of fungi that we see. May have become multicellular, much like some of the protists, probably forming colonial relationships, like we talked about with the multicellular algae. So colonial relationships, where you'd have several cells working collectively, some maybe being more efficient at certain things than others, and eventually lead to multicellularity, right? They would have colonized land somewhere around 300 million years ago, so they've existed for quite some time. And then now going through the classification, so here we want to think of phylum, right? So domain Eukarya, kingdom fungi, right? And now the various phyla. So we're just going to look at three main phyla, and they're all classified based on their forms of reproduction. So this first group here, Zygomycota. So these guys are found in soil rich in organic matter, found in soil, so they're terrestrial, rich in organic matter. Their hyphae are coencetic, and their life cycle is shown here. So what I want you to think about is every fruiting body is producing spores. And some of you might, think of this, if you're walking through the forest, a classic fungi is a puffball. So if you ever stepped on one of those things and just this kind of cloud of smoke comes out, it's really just a cloud of spores. So what you want to think about is this network of hyphae growing and growing underground. And then some of these branches become mating hyphae. So if we blow this up a little bit, so what we've got here is these, much like the alternation of generations that we looked at in seaweeds. So this strand may end up fusing with this strand. And so what you've got here is these are two hyphae extensions, and these hyphae basically fuse together, forming this structure down here, which is basically the fusion of two separate hyphae. And those nuclei fuse, and the genetic material from each hyphae fuses together, and that forms this structure called a zygospore. And so hence the group's name, Zygomycota. Again, mycota for fungus, zygo with reference to the reproductive structure that's formed when the two hyphae fuse together, and the DNA from each cell of the hyphae combining to form what we call a diploid structure. And again, I'll be going through this repeatedly. So from this zygospore now grows this tall stalk, and at the end of this tall stalk is what we call a sporangium, and that sporangium is where the spores are produced. And so inside there, more spores are produced, and those spores fall to the ground and just grow into more and more hyphae. All right. And so that's essentially, each group is just slightly different in their reproductive life cycle, and they have slightly different structures, but all producing spores that grow into hyphae, form some sort of reproductive structure that will then grow into more spore producing structures. Okay, so just to try and reiterate there, and what I want you to think about or focus on, right, is so mycota, referring to fungi, and then zygo, this group, phylum Zygomycota, is the reproductive structure is a zygospore. All right. If we move on to the next group, these are the classic group that you think of, and I'll write this down here for you. This is the classic group that you sort of think of when you think of a mushroom, right? They're the classic mushroom that you buy in the grocery store to eat, and the term basidio refers to club-like fungi, right? Club-like fungi. All right, and so their reproductive structure is a basidiospore. If I blow this up a little bit, you'll see it. So if you were to look underneath, and you can see the gills when you buy your mushrooms at the store, you can see all of these gills underneath. And if we were to look at those gills microscopically, we would see these little extensions here, which contain the nuclei. And so if we look at these, those are the basidiospores that make up the gill. We don't see them, they're microscopic, right? But again, what I want you to think of is you've got different mating strains that produce the gametes that are the reproductive structures that will grow into the hyphae. These hyphae can come from different organisms, and the hyphae of one organism may fuse with the hyphae of another, and this fusion, right, is then going to be the transfer of genetic material, which then can grow into the fruiting body. And then this fruiting body again releases spores and so on and so forth, and the process goes. The reproductive life cycles of these guys can get pretty complex, so we're just going to focus on just what the structure looks like, and recognizing that club fungi have this classic shape, right? The zygomycota, they have sort of the sporangium growing on a long stalk like so. If you look at your bread mold closely, you would see that this Rhizopus stolonopher is a common bread mold, or mold found on bread. And so that's the main thing that we'll look at. Our last group here, phylum Ascomycota. So this term asco refers to what are sac-like fungi. All right, so their fruiting body is in the form of more of a cup shape like you see down here, or maybe like a sac. And of course, the spore forming structures in there are referred to as ascospores, right? And hence Ascomycota. These guys are most commonly, they're very diverse, found in all habitats and mainly parasitic. However, they do include one group, which are your yeasts. So yeasts are a member of this phylum. So our baker's yeast and brewer's yeast. Okay, last group, which really we won't look at anything in particular, but just to say that Deuteromycota represents, sorry, big sneeze. Deuteromycota represents what we call fungi imperfecti. And simply because their reproduction is often unknown, and so unable to classify into any other group, basically. So unable to classify into the other groups. Example of this group is your athlete's foot, which is a fungus, right, or the result of a fungus. And so in some cases, from what I understand, I think there's certain groups or certain species where some taxonomists group them into phylum Ascomycota. because their reproductive life cycle is similar to that. But to be quite honest, I don't know, and I think it's more complex than that. But that's the last group, and just basically understanding that they don't really have a well understood reproductive cycle. Okay, ecological roles. So I think what I'll do here is I'll type these in, and then you can just start the video to get them. So as mentioned before, these organisms form a lot of different kinds of symbiotic relationships. So parasitic, like mentioned up above, many of them cause disease in all kinds of ecosystems. So we refer to that as a plus minus symbiotic relationship. One benefits, one is harmed. And a lot of them are not just disease causing in trees and plants, but even on animals, right? This is where I was talking about the zombie ants. So a lot of them, the spores will they'll be taken in by various hosts, and then the spore grows within the host and ultimately leads to the demise of the host itself. But there's lots of mutualistic relationships between fungi and other organisms. So we call this a plus because both benefit, right? Mutualistic. So examples are like lichen, which is a mutualistic relationship between fungus and algae, and you find all kinds of lichen within forest ecosystems. Super valuable. They can be good ecological indicators. So because they're very sensitive to air pollution and soil pollution, that if they're present in the forest ecosystem, it's a good sign that it's a healthy ecosystem. There's also fungus and other plants in the form of mycorrhizae, similar to the bacteria that lives in the roots of plants. So again, these fungus living on the roots of plants help the plants to absorb nutrients that the plant needs. So it's kind of the benefit comes from the fungus receiving carbohydrate from the plant, and the fungus providing the plant with other compounds essential to its growth. And so, of course, food for many organisms, right, in the natural world, and also, food for us. They provide a lot of shelter and homes for organisms, and of course, big ecological role as decomposers, right? That saprotrophic nature of them. Last section here down at the bottom is just fungi and humans and how we've incorporated fungi into many different aspects of the food industry. And so I'm just going to pause the video and I'll fill these things in, and then I'll start the video and you can get what you need. Okay, so I've highlighted the sections to sort of fill in your blanks. Fungi and industry, so we use them in the production of antibiotics. A fungus was where the first antibiotic was discovered, penicillin, coming from the species Penicillium. And that's the classic, if you look at an orange that's got mold growing on it, that sort of blue-green mold, that species of fungi produces the antibiotic penicillin. We also see them in some species used to transform compounds into things like cortisone, anti-inflammatory steroid used extensively. We've used fungi in a lot of DNA biotechnology, incorporating genetic information from viruses, bacteria, etc., and used in the production of vaccines. Of course, yeast we use, brewer's yeast, in the production of ethanol for beer, wine, spirits, and as well biodiesel and the production of gasoline. And down at the bottom, again, just listing a few things where we find fungi in the food that we eat. Aspergillus, I think it's Aspergillus, a fungus that is the mold that we use in forming things like soy sauce. Other compounds that are extracted from fungus like citric acid and gluconic acid, which are used in manufacturing of soft drinks, candies, all kinds of things. And finally, of course, they are pathogenic. So yes, we get disease from various fungi as well. Sorry, I had to end that one with a bang, literally. Had a 3-year-old that popped a balloon unexpectedly, tears everywhere. So that's it. We will see you tomorrow.